What had happened to our emissions if we don't worry about the stuff we didn't control?
There's not a whole lot happening there, is it?
Well, they've gone up.
They've gone up. I could rest a beer on this, actually. So when Prime Minister Morrison says at the G7 we've reduced our emissions by 20%, this is what he's talking about, conveniently neglecting to mention that A, we haven't reduced them, they just
reduced.
They reduced. But we're not doing anything really in any other sector.
So Matt Canavan's right.
Yeah.
The electricity sector, the industry sector, the transport sector, we're not reducing emissions there.
Yeah.
All of the emission reduction that the Prime Minister's bragging about is happening in this land use sector.
Yeah.
And that's the sector where the federal government doesn't really have any relevant policy. Hi, I'm Richard Dennis, Chief Economist at the Australia Institute.
Hi, I'm Polly. I'm an advisor in the Climate and Energy team at the Australia Institute.
And welcome to Ask an Economist. Polly, what's our first question today?
Oh, we've got a question based on something Matt Canavan said on the radio yesterday.
Oh, Matt? What's he done now?
Oh, Matt, yeah, I know. Just remind you, Matt's
Is he wearing some coal on his face?
Well, he's the guy who took a photo of a sticker on a ute that said "Black Coal Matters."
Oh, I missed that one.
So he's not only politically correct, he's a really likeable guy. Anyway, he said on the radio yesterday,
we've actually met emission reduction targets. It's not because people in the cities, that hasn't happened. What's happened is we've reforested, or we've stopped farmers from clearing their own land. Our farming areas are going down and declining, and that's the reason we've lowered our emissions.
So, Polly, what's he saying?
So he's not wrong, but I need to give you some context. Yeah, on your Matt.
First time for everything.
He's talking about something very specific that happened historically in about 2005, though, like when
2005. So before this government was even formed.
Oh yeah, way before.
Back in the Howard years.
Had your Nickelback cover band. But to explain that, I just want to give you a bit of context about how we measure emissions reductions in general, if that's all right. So in Australia, we look at our entire economy, like all these different sectors of the economy, to see how we're reducing our emissions, or where emissions are coming from, I should say.
Power stations, factories, cars, and the land sector.
Yeah, everything. So, but I'll get to the land sector in a minute. We put all these sources of emissions in a list. We're a signatory to the UNFCCC, the United Nations Convention on Climate Change, got that out, and we send it in to them every year. And the reason why we do that is because it allows us to see how we're tracking against our climate commitments.
So these are our greenhouse accounts.
Yeah, these are our literally it's
and we lodge them with the UN once a year. Here's what we did.
Yep, here's what we did, and that allows us to kind of look back over the years and see how we're tracking. There's this one sector of the economy that we kind of casually call the land sector, which is actually officially called land use change and forestry.
LULUCF.
LULUCF.
Ooh, rolls off the tongue.
Also happens to be the name of my daughter. It's a name that runs in the family with my grandmother's name. It's something that's pretty close to my heart. Anyway, LULUCF, or land use, is basically what we do with plants.
So
crops,
chopping down trees, planting trees, all that kind of stuff.
But more than that, like how we manage crops, wetlands and everything. Yeah, so are we cutting down trees? Are we regrowing trees?
Bushfires.
We do take that into account, but it's more about the management really. And that's what the land sector is, or what LULUCF is. And the reason why we're kind of interested in that is because unlike all these other sectors of the economy that are just producing emissions, the land sector is capable of producing emissions. You cut down a tree, that releases carbon into the atmosphere.
So chop down a tree rots, carbon dioxide, methane coming out.
Out of the soil. But when you plant a tree, that actually sequesters carbon.
Like carbon capture and storage.
That's exactly. I think that's actually what Angus Taylor's talking about when he's giving $50 million.
So we know how to capture storage. Yeah. Plant a tree. Don't chop it down.
Pretty much.
Okay.
Yeah. Unfortunately, there's not enough trees in the world to capture all the carbon that's in the atmosphere, but it's a minor problem. Yeah. So it's an interesting sector because we try and claim emissions reductions as a result of the fact that trees can sequester carbon.
So Australia's taking credit for the fact that there's kind of more trees on the continent than there was in 2005.
Yeah.
So,
yeah,
yay us, we sequestered.
So yes. Yeah, or not even that there's more trees. So Canavan said we reforested, but then he stepped back from that. We just stopped cutting stuff down.
So we stopped land clearing as much.
Yeah.
So we get kudos for not clearing land.
That's right.
Wow.
Because eventually that vegetation is going to regrow, that will store that carbon, and that results in emissions abatement for us.
So planting trees, good. Not chopping down trees, good.
Yep.
Sequestering carbon in plants,
Yep.
good.
Yep.
And Matt Canavan's just said all of Australia's emission reductions have come from those sectors.
Yeah, but you know what? He actually didn't go far enough. There's other reductions.
Come on, Matt.
Can we chuck up a graph? All right. So remember how I told you that we report every year on all our emissions reductions, or all our emissions? This is a graph that shows that across all those sectors I was talking about.
Over time,
yep.
What's happened in each of these different sectors.
Correct.
So the electricity sector, industry, transport, waste and fugitive emissions, agriculture, and here's your daughter, LULUCF.
Oh, LULUCF, yeah.
And little LULUCF used to be a big source of emissions, and now it's actually shrunk.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'll explain what Senator Canavan is talking about. So he is talking about this period here.
So 2005.
2005. So what was happening in 2005 in Australia?
Nickelback, John Howard.
Nickelback, Kelly Clarkson, like Juicy Couture tracksuits. It was a wild time for everyone, especially in Queensland, because the Queensland government was about to place a ban on broad-scale clearing in Queensland. So
land clearing. They were going to stop farmers knocking down all the trees on their farms.
Yep, correct. Prior to that, they just started handing out clearing permits like confetti, like just everyone here have.
And
a
this was the
clearing
footage of bulldozers with chains between them, just driving along, knocking down all the trees they could find.
People just went like crazy and just started clearing like thousands of hectares of land. That's why this is so high. And then they stopped.
Right.
So they stopped that clearing, clearly. The trees started growing back. So emissions dropped because they were sequestering carbon, like emissions from land clearing dropped. But there's other stuff happening here too. In here, 2010 to 2011, emissions dropped more because La Nina rains ended the drought. There was a really big drought at this time. So we had like this massive amount of rain and the vegetation just went crazy.
So when it rains and trees grow, Australia reduces emissions. Because we own a whole continent, and when it rains across a continent and lots of trees grow, carbon gets sequestered, and we record that in our accounts.
That's right.
Is that something the farmers did?
Look, I'll get to that.
They made it rain.
I don't think so, but I'll get to that. Then there's something else happening in 2017. Yep, up here we had this really big drought from 2017 to 2019.
Yep.
And that resulted in there being less cattle, less sheep, so there were less methane emissions, but it's not really part of the land sector, what we refer to as LULUCF, but there was also less crops, so you're using less fertiliser, which is a greenhouse gas. So it's really busy up here, I get that, like Canavan's not wrong, that there are a lot of drops here, he didn't quite go far enough. What's really important, I think, is that none of these are a result of federal government policy.
Breaking the drought wasn't government policy?
Unless there was something going on that I'm not aware of.
Right.
Like
so let's recap. The Queensland state government said you can't clear as many trees.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
And that meant more trees grew. The drought broke and lots of trees grew. Good. Not really federal government policy. No. And then the drought came back and people didn't grow as many crops, run as many cattle, use as much fertiliser, so emissions fell.
Oh, and there's one more thing. Actually, all through this time is we had a decline in our native forest industry. So we're cutting down less of native forests for logging and things like that.
And the federal government was a big fan of ending native forest logging?
No, that again is kind of market forces.
Right.
Yeah. Not nature, like drought or anything, that was market forces. So we love to take credit for all this, but really kind of all happening by accident.
And really. if we take LULUCF out, we've got electricity, industry, transport, waste and agriculture. What has happened to our emissions if we don't worry about the stuff we didn't control?
There's not a whole lot happening there, is it?
Well, they've gone up.
They've gone up. Like, this is pretty... I could rest a beer on this, actually. I could sleep comfortably on this graph. There is nothing happening. So when Prime Minister Morrison says at the G7, we've reduced our emissions by 20%, this is what he's talking about, conveniently neglecting to mention that, we haven't reduced them, they just
reduced.
They reduced. But we're not doing anything really in any other sector.
So Matt Canavan's right.
Yeah.
The electricity sector, the industry sector, the transport sector, we're not reducing emissions there. Yeah. All of the emission reduction that the Prime Minister's bragging about is happening in this land use sector.
Yeah.
And that's the sector where the federal government doesn't really have any relevant policy.
No, they don't really. And a lot of countries, when they report on this, they take out LULUCF in recognition of the fact that it's...
So Germany, Japan, UK, US, when they say we're reducing emissions, they're not talking about droughts and flooding rains.
No.
They're talking about electricity, industry. Okay.
Yeah, so they do count them. It's within the rules to count this. Like, Australia's actually not, it's not breaking any rules. It's, it's not playing very fair. It's not really the spirit of the Paris Agreement, where we all should be like lifting our weight or doing our bit.
And I think people think when they hear our emissions are falling that it's falling because we're burning less fossil fuels.
Yeah, but that's not happening.
This is the one sector where that actually isn't the case. So when other countries are talking about reducing emissions, they're talking about what they're doing in electricity, in industry, in transport and waste. They're talking about in Germany, Japan, the US, UK, actually reducing fossil fuel use emissions, while we in Australia have got the fossil fuel emissions going up, but droughts and flooding rains, flouts and flooding plains are fixing it for us. Well, can we compare that to other countries? What do we know? Have we got some data on that?
We can.
Oh, look at that. Here's one we prepared earlier.
So what this graph is showing is how countries have performed or reduced their emissions since 2005 if you take away those land sector emissions, if you don't count LULUCF.
So just the fossil fuel burning stuff, electricity, industry, transport.
Yeah.
So this is Australia. What's happened to our emissions from fossil fuels?
Our emissions have actually increased by 7%.
We're not leading the world.
We're not.
I thought we were reducing emissions.
And actually, Scott Morrison at the Leaders Summit on Climate, he went out of his way to say we are doing more than most other similar economies.
So our emissions from transport, industry and energy have gone up.
Yep.
Okay. And what about this?
So this is the US.
So their emissions have fallen?
Their emissions have fallen. They've reduced theirs by 11%.
And?
This is the EU.
So Europe's emissions have fallen?
Yep.
And who's this?
This is the UK. They've actually reduced their emissions by 33%.
Wow. So leading the world.
Leading the world in all the wrong ways.
Right. So to summarise, when Australia uses the emission reductions that come from trees growing and from not knocking them down as fast, our accounts look good.
They look great.
But
unfortunately, we can't just rely on having droughts all the time.
Damn! Maybe that's what Matt Canavan was hoping.
Solid policy. That's not going to happen. None of that stuff that happened in the 2000s is repeatable. So if we take that away, we don't need to go back to the other graph, but we're not on a net zero trajectory. So
our emissions are still rising.
Yeah, they're still rising, and we're not going to get, our target of 26 to 28% on 2005 levels is considered weak anyway, but we're not going to get there.
So when Matt Canavan says it's agriculture that's saving the day, what he's really saying is that drought really knocked agricultural production down and therefore emissions are a lot lower.
Yeah, pretty much.
Wow. Way to save the agriculture sector, Matt Canavan. Climate-induced droughts.
But I'm glad he said it.
He's right.
He's right. Yeah.
He's right. All of the emission reductions we're bragging about happened in the land sector, not because of transformation of our economy.
Yeah, exactly. There was no decarbonisation.
Whoops. Thanks, Matt, and thanks for your question. We make these videos to give you the facts, the arguments and the tools you need to both understand what's being said and, more importantly, talk to your friends and your family about what's really going on. So if you like these videos, if you like the facts, if you like the arguments, please subscribe, please share and please send us questions so we can answer them for you.